Hello, it's Brad Laurie, or BlockchainBrad, and today we're having a crypto conversation with none other than Kurt. He is from CryptoTradersPro.com, and he's well-versed when it comes to things tech and beyond in the space of blockchain and crypto. Kurt, thank you so much, mate, for having this free conversation. Hopefully today it's about free flow, and it's about letting us know exactly what you contribute and think about all these different market movements today.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Brad. I'm excited to talk to you.
Likewise, mate. And the idea, obviously, is also to learn from you, Kurt. So I want to just sort of open it up. There's no pre-planned conversation here. It's really just to let things literally flow. Mate, Let's start with you and a bit of your background as well, so we can understand, where you come from, what brought you into crypto, and so where you position now with your company.
Sure. Well, it's a long story. I'm a 2012er. I got into Bitcoin. I was actually in the printing industry, and I've always been a political activist. Entrepreneur and political activism has just been kind of defined most of my adult life. And in 2012, somebody reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you print me up some posters, and I'll pay you in Bitcoin?" And I didn't know what the heck Bitcoin was. And I said, "Sure, what the heck?" He only wanted like $50 worth of stuff, so I was like, no skin off my back. Right, so I was like, yeah, that's fine. And so he paid me Bitcoin, and he was very passionate, but I didn't get it at the time. And I moved on. I didn't really look much into it since then, or for like probably 4 or 5 months. I think I posted a couple things on Facebook, like, "Hey, does anybody know what this Bitcoin thing is about?" And nobody really responded. And then I started discovering videos from two people, Adam Kokesh, who is actually, he's currently running for Libertarian Party presidential ticket in the United States, but he's very off base, but has a really killer style. And he was a Bitcoiner. And then old videos from Roger Ver. And so I was like, okay, wow, that's fascinating. So I read the white paper, got really involved, and then started to become an advocate in like 2013. And I got into the mining space. So I mined in late 2013 into 2014. Got into the scaling debate early, so I was an early big blocker.
Interesting.
Yeah, real early. Bitcoin Unlimited, like 2015. Kind of into the Jeff Garzik, Mike Hearn, Gavin Andresen crew. Like Bitcoin should scale on chain and all of that. I didn't think it was particularly political at the time. It's turned into probably the most political argument in Bitcoin.
We are going to have a good conversation. I can't wait to learn more from you because, firstly, you're open about this discussion. And secondly, I think there needs to be more discussion on these points, quite frankly.
I agree completely. And then from there, the Bitcoin debate, I got into altcoins. I really liked, Dash and Digibyte and Monero. I ended up mining Monero for a couple of years as well. It was another project that I really liked. Then 2017 came. It was the thing that brought in tons more people, obviously tons more market action. And that's when we started Crypto Traders on Facebook. It's currently one of the larger groups on Facebook. It's a private group. It was based on specifically on trading. It was founded by my business partner Matthew, who's a standard equities trader. He's a classically trained stock trader, and he needed somebody to do fundamental analytics and stuff. So he reached out to me. We were very casually acquainted on Facebook and said, "Hey, I want to stop people from getting like screwed on ICOs and pump and dumps, and teach them how to read charts, and let's see if we can provide value as being like calling out scammers, but being objective and all of that." And I was like, yeah, you know what? That sounds great. And we've been doing that now the last little more than 2 years now.
Wow. So it's going well for you in terms of profitability and success?
It is. The community, we charge like $100 a month to let people in. We do technical analysis. We're not a signals group. We teach you how to trade. Both from a technical analysis and a fundamental analysis standpoint. We do weekly calls, webinars, that kind of thing as well, but we're not, everybody's like, "Man, where are the signals?" We're not a signals group.
I think that's a really good point to make as well, so that people aren't sort of, disillusioned if they have some sort of expectation of signaling, and we see others doing that. But Kurt, I really want to there's so many things in what you said in terms of your history that got you in. One of the things you mentioned is that, started in with, in that Bitcoiner group, and then from there things changed. Let's start with that, because quite frankly, BTC and Bitcoin, it started with the narrative of circumventing authority. There was suggestions at the time of privacy, but as you look more into it, you quickly learn some of these things that were offered by BTC perhaps were misunderstood. So let's start with your understanding of BTC. Why was it that what drew you to it initially that offered something of a solution to if indeed there was a problem at the time?
Well, so for me, it was the idea of decentralized, frictionless cash. And that was coming from like a libertarian activist standpoint. I was a big gold bug. Ron Paul, Hayek, the Austrian school of economics was a big thing for me. So I was very much a gold standard advocate, and basically realized, this is never going to happen. Fiat currency is what it is for a reason, and it's the most powerful people in the world in control of that. And how could we possibly take down that massive hierarchy there?
Right.
And Bitcoin didn't stand out as a great option until I actually read into it, and then I realized, wow, Bitcoin is actually digital gold, but not in the way people think about it today. Like the digital gold narrative is that it's this store of value, and that's all you do with it is it's like a savings account. And what I loved about Bitcoin is that it has the properties of gold, but it also has the properties of a decentralized payment system. So it's this payment network. Like that's the thing that actually matters, because we have stores of value like gold or other precious metals and those kind of things. But it was the combination in my mind of the ability to do frictionless business with people in anywhere where there's internet,
right,
while also having my own sovereignty in Bitcoin. So, and that was something I did. I started paying employees and vendors who would accept it in 2013. I was like, hey guys, this is this payment network, and it's not government issued, and there's 21 million, and the Bitcoin 101 discussion. But for me, it was always that value of being able to conduct business in Bitcoin, because that's real value. It's business.
Kurt, it's so fascinating what you're saying, because firstly, I'm agnostic when it comes to all the different camps. I want to make that clear. And I know that's a safe position, but it just is the case because, there's different aspects to different parts that are interesting to me. But to have an open discussion, I think it, behooves me to have that agnostic position now. But in saying that, I do agree with you that the white paper itself was extremely attractive to anyone in that libertarian camp, or even anyone who wanted to advocate for a means in which we could transact value or exchange some sort of asset and not have top-down controls. That's essentially what the value prop was of the white paper. But interestingly, at the time, we had a whole group of cyberpunks that were really pushing forward this narrative and this movement. And certainly at the time when Bitcoin came out in that 2009-10 period, there were a few people who were really aware of its its premise, its design, how it was architected, that it was released and open sourced. And in saying that, I want to ask you what the agenda was at the time. Do you agree that the majority of people in the beginning, when Bitcoin emerged, were actually supporting the white paper itself in terms of philosophy translated into action?
100%. That was it. It may have just been my experience based on who I was in circles with. So I don't want to speak for the whole of Bitcoin's community, but the people that I was communicating with, like that was the exciting thing. Like, hey, I can do business with somebody and nobody can stop me. And that's still sort of discussed, but it's sort of seen as like a secondary, like it doesn't seem like the important thing about BTC anymore. But the thing that really stood out to me at the time was that it's like gold that I can email to you, and that's what stood out to me. Like when somebody explained it that way, I was like, wow, okay, I get that. But I remember when I first got interested, there was actually a hard fork in BTC, and a lot of people don't know this because it's not discussed anymore. But there was an inflation bug, and somebody pushed code out. And I can't remember what the supply, it was some outrageous, like it allowed for 10 times the circulating supply of Bitcoin or something like that.
Wow.
And it was discovered by Jeff Garzik, who immediately pushed it out into Bitcoin Talk and like tagged Satoshi and tried to tag everybody, like, holy crap, guys, like somebody just broke Bitcoin. what do we do? And it was like, well, if we continue to mine this chain going forward, we're going to have 210 million coins or whatever it was. I don't recall the number, but it was an inflation bug. And it was having blocks built upon it. And they looked at it and they're like, okay, well, what do we do? Do we roll back the chain? How do we fix Bitcoin? And what was decided, it was essentially to hard fork, orphan those transactions that were going forward. And this was, I think it went on for about half a day. So it was a number of blocks going that direction. And they said, you know what? The white paper is what matters. And we're going to hard fork. We're going to orphan everything that we've done since this rule change that is not Bitcoin. And we're going to come back to, for lack of a better term, the constitution of what Bitcoin is. And do we all agree? Do all the miners agree? Okay, cool. That's what we're doing. We're going to hard fork back to this block. We're going to fix it. So this notion that a hard fork of Bitcoin is somehow invalid or that's absurd, because it actually happened another time in 2011. This was before my time, but at the time Satoshi said exactly that, or maybe it was 2010. I forget now, but Satoshi said, hey, we have to hard fork. Somebody broke the code. And the difference is that it was non-contentious, obviously.
But it happened, and it can happen.
And it was non-contentious because of the understanding that the Bitcoin is that the white paper is the standard upon which Bitcoin is defined. And that was a universally accepted concept. They just said, yeah, if we change Bitcoin fundamentally, then it's not Bitcoin. But hard forking it to keep it fundamentally the same is good.
So the big question is, I want to jump in and ask you, now, when you say we, again, a lot of people don't talk about the centralized nature of decision-making at the time, because essentially there was a degree of social consensus, despite the mechanisms and the operations of Bitcoin and the way in which it organically and autonomously operates. As you know, there were still key figures at the time. Now, if the majority at the time were indeed pro white paper, then why is it that they weren't also advocating for this increase, in the block size, increase in scalability at the time? Why were some deciding to stifle that?
I don't really know when or where that conversation started. And in fact, the first time I heard somebody discussing the absoluteness of a 1 megabyte block cap being permanent, I thought it was such a bad idea that it wasn't worth discussing. I just didn't even want to debate with those people. I was like, well, that doesn't make a lick of sense. So your bad ideas will disappear, because, even at the time, like I have a bunch of old tweets saved from like Andreas Antonopoulos and Adam Back, who's now the CEO of Blockstream, and other players just talking very casually about, oh yeah, we'll have 2 megabyte Bitcoin blocks, and then we'll double it probably to 4 and then to 8. And by 2020, maybe we'll be at 8 or 16 megabyte blocks or whatever.
So it was very casual. It was expected that, scaling would be a norm.
Right. As storage and bandwidth gets cheaper and demand for the blockchain goes up, we will just slowly scale things up to meet demand and let Bitcoin be functional as a payment network. And that really wasn't contentious or argued about. I think the first time I really heard kind of that toxicity started to be like maybe late 2015, 2016. And all of a sudden it just turned into like, you're a big blocker, as if that was some kind of and it was like, no, that's the fundamental design of the network. We're not the other. You're coming up with this notion that Bitcoin is permanent at this scale, and it's only ever supposed to do this one pigeonholed thing, which is not a payment network. So now,
we're going to talk about that, because that's fascinating. I want to move across to the 2015 switch, but before we do, I want to talk about gold for a moment. Now, you clearly understand how that works, but you're also suggesting, in the references to gold, that there is that inherent, value system whereby people can arguably store their wealth. We're seeing now significant change in markets, not just crypto. And yes, there's very significant, especially today, but even in the normal markets, often gold is used as a hedge and safeguard when fiat currencies or, stock market's struggling. But
Yeah.
let's talk about the fundamentals though for a second, because a lot of people perhaps don't understand about the synergies and the implications of a combination of different asset classifications within what is gold, in terms of utility, in terms of commodity, in terms of currency itself. Often you see an alignment and of these different typologies that make up what gold has been in historically, or could arguably be regarded as something today, in different ways, or look at it in different ways to explain its functionality. Now the question is, does that, or is that replicated in BTC necessarily? Given that you and I are talking about the imperative of a global borderless currency, that potentially can be enabled in different ways, even digitally, if someone wanted to do that with gold. It was also historically currency at different times, as most importantly, it was a utility. So is it reasonable that people superimpose the functionality and the systems that gold have brought to the world, on Bitcoin? Do you think that they are directly correlated?
I think it's interesting because, I don't disagree that Bitcoin was designed to be a digital form of gold. Where I disagree is that you only take the one basic aspect of gold, in that it is a store of value, because gold is so many other things. Gold, I have gold fillings, and the computers that we're communicating through right now, these signals are going through gold circuits. Gold has value because of its utility. It also has the word intrinsic is debated among Bitcoiners as well, but gold has an intrinsic, like, wow, it's special, it's scarce, and all of these things. But the BTC community, the maximalists, are obsessed with this. Well, Bitcoin is provably scarce, and that's its primary utility. And I mean, it's a feature, but that's not a utility in and of itself. And that's my big disagreement with the Bitcoin.
Well, let's discuss this argument for a second, because I really want to, and I have a different perspective on this perhaps, so I'd love to share that and sort of extrapolate upon this, because it is a discussion, not a debate. But when we talk about the finite nature of gold, firstly, when it comes to physicalization, when it comes to properties, when it comes to discovery of gold on Earth itself, regardless of meteors coming, there is a finite amount, regardless of how much we discover. It's just a more of a geological and scientific proof and fact.
Yep.
But when it comes to Bitcoin, because of the nature of it, because it's mechanistic, because it's essentially a software based on an algorithm and a code, arguably, that can be altered based on consensus, based on the structures and the powers that be. So in that sense, is it reasonable to suggest that it is finite? Is it reasonable to suggest that there is this, guaranteed 21 million supply, when we know in the past that things can be changed?
Right. I mean, we saw it got changed by accident in 2013. That's the long and short of it right there. And there's not been an insignificant amount of people talking about the need for more Bitcoin inflation anyways. Like, we've seen it from Peter Todd over the last 6 months, who is not the most influential guy now, but he is historically a very influential Bitcoin developer. We've seen guys like Matt Luongo and a number of other, even Tony Vay's mentioned, inflation. Inflation's a discussion that we should be having. And Bitcoin's gone through a governance change that a lot of people aren't aware of either. In 2017, with UASF, the SegWit soft fork, they basically said that, like, look, the governance of the network is by consensus of listening nodes. And a listening node is a node that has the whole blockchain but doesn't mine it. It doesn't have the ability to build a block. You can run one of these for $60 worth of hardware and probably $100 a year in internet and storage costs. So your all-in cost, let's just say it's $500 a year to be part of the governance of this multi-billion-dollar worldwide network. And therefore, it's pretty easy to change culturally. You just change those people that are part of that new governance model. And yeah, why the heck not? Why not make it 55 million coins or 100 million coins and just pay for Bitcoin to be mined using inflation forever? And
right, and that's why we start to get into the conversation of what we've seen emerge with paper money, when we've seen fiat being printed with inflation being altered, when we see the amounts of essentially the cash that flows determined by top-down entities, obviously governments. But in that sense, I really want to talk about 2 points again on that gold comparison. And one of them is that with gold, once again, there's been historical references and proof that currency has been part of the gold conversation. So if we go back to that white paper for a minute, Kurt, clearly the premise there is to have some sort of borderless peer-to-peer currency-based system. But with gold, that's emerged. We know that for sure. The initial point of value was a cultural sort of colouring of a utility first, but it did emerge as a currency. Now, the question is, does Bitcoin have the technological capacity to function as a global currency? If indeed, we look at the code right now and the state of it, could it cope with such a thing?
The most honest answer to that question is that we don't know. There's a lot of debate about it. That's what the big block debate has been for a number of years. One of the reasons why I consider myself a BSV supporter is I respect anyone that's willing to push so hard that they may break their own blockchain. But that's how progress is made, right? We didn't fly to the moon because we weren't willing to risk things. And so they're seeing what is Bitcoin actually capable of. If you just kind of take all the safeties off and push the pedal to the metal, what does it do? Does it burst into flames and it just doesn't work? Or how much does it work? And we don't know until we push it. What I do know is that BTC absolutely cannot. But the problem is cultural right now. BTC is not willing to try. In fact, of all the blockchains that exist in the entire space, they are the least willing to try. So they have the smallest block size limit, the slowest block time. They have the slowest throughput of any blockchain, period. And they see that as their value proposition, which I personally think is absurd. Of course, that's a political argument, but I think it's silly. It's silly.
Well, let's talk about that, because often the emotive sort of aspect of this comes to play, and really quickly in the crypto space, especially in crypto Twitter, for example. So I want to talk about the power of ownership in this context as well, because you were mentioning before in 2015 things really did change, and I read into that because I wasn't around in the space at that time, but I certainly could see it when you look back. It was a very strong flippening of sort of mentality, the way in which people would really look at the different possibilities. So going back to ownership, is it possible that just those that invested, those that regarded it as an investment for a start, really started to change and morph the agenda itself? Because if we're talking about the white paper, Kurt, it's not an investment according to the white paper. It's a technology that's enabling us to essentially do trade with new, less authoritative means, but new means of power for the people. That's basically what it was planned to do. And so the advocates from the start had that agenda. But when ownership became something of prominence, when it was clear that things were moving up in value, everything changed. So what is your take on the personal greed, personal pursuit of and avarice for more?
Sure. I mean, sound money, the nature of sound money is that it should absorb value from unsound money slowly over time. So there is always that incentive built into sound money. This is why I liked the gold standard 10 years ago or 15 years ago at this point. Let's say, totally pre-Bitcoin. Why does sound money matter? Well, sound money matters because it's finite and it's utilitarian, and it encourages you to save more than you spend. The current world economy works on an inflationary standard that says spend more than you save because your money is losing value slowly over time. And we understand that. We're programmed to spend primarily. Bitcoin should be the opposite. It should push you to save more. It rewards you if you save more, but it also needs to have that utility of the fact that it's a payment network. It's a payment tool. So, you should be trying to earn it rather than this sort of meme of stacking sats or just buy Bitcoin. Like, build a business, earn Bitcoin, then pay your employees in Bitcoin, but do it in such a way that you are accruing profit in units of Bitcoin. And then those units of profit in Bitcoin that you save should accrue that value, but that doesn't ignore the fact that it is supposed to be a means of exchange and all of that. And it's bizarre to me. I saw a funny tweet. It was like Bitcoin in 2015, people argued that Bitcoin was a Ponzi scheme attached to a payment network. And by 2018, they just completely got rid of the payment network part.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about this a minute, because if you're alluding to how little the Bitcoin maximalists are willing to acknowledge the value of currency, the value of trying to utilize this in an everyday scenario, then let's explore that in the context of what really is happening. Some argue right now that it is trying to move into a payment system, that there are third parties that are trying to make this transition from the Bitcoin or the crypto world and the mainstream. Is that really happening, or is that just a small camp in itself?
It was happening more in the 2014 and 2015 era. I remember when Overstock.com announced that they're going to be accepting Bitcoin, and I remember Microsoft accepting it on Xbox Live and these different things. It was like, all right, cool, this is really happening. I can pay for, and I was that guy. I was like, sure, I'll switch to Dish Network because they accept Bitcoin. I want to promote that and encourage them, and then therefore encourage their other competitors, and let's use it. We need to create velocity in that economy. And really, since then, I would argue, I don't know the statistics, but I would argue that probably peaked in 2016, and it's just kind of pilfered off. People have dropped support. Steam dropped Bitcoin in 2017 or 2018, and it was a huge gaming network. And they just said it's worthless. It doesn't work as a payment tool. The fees are too high. And it's done nothing but lose that really for the last probably 3, maybe almost 4 years now, where it just seems like Bitcoin acceptance as a payment tool has just dropped. It's definitely in a downtrend.
So if we take away the fact that there is this downtrend in terms of uptake for its purpose as a borderless currency, then what does Bitcoin fundamentally do? And I'm being really serious about this, because if we take away the narrative, if we take away the store of value prospect, because that's essentially what that is. SOV by core design is prospecting for value, in the sense of hoping that other people will contribute to that narrative and thus build that price. If we take away that, what is the true utility of BTC now, today?
I mean, it is the most liquid asset. So, let's say I wanted to buy a submarine from Russia, and that's how I needed to transact. Like, I would have to use BTC. Like that would be one example. So the liquidity, the settlement liquidity is obviously there. Okay, it still has the most infrastructure.
I just want to jump in though. So if liquidity is it, this is important because people don't talk about fiat enough in that answer. Because for liquidity to be of value, fiat has to be the primary asset, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely the unit of account.
So how does that work?
And actually,
if there's a intractable connection between fiat and Bitcoin, if liquidity and store of value is the narrative, that means that people, for the most part, are not necessarily hodling permanently or with no endpoint, but they're actually hodling to a point, their own personal point, in which they do a transfer for purchases and goods, and for just converting into global money that's accepted now from the top down, so they can have more wealth.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's a cultural thing. It's the same as, like, you can talk about intellectual property or something. Like in the West, it's something that we absolutely adore, but in the East, you go to China and intellectual property, they don't view it the same way at all. So, to say culturally that the store of value maximalism is intrinsically wrong, is probably unfair. I think it's wrong from a utilitarian standpoint, and I think it breaks the economics of the network. But at the same time, like I said, if I needed to do a huge international purchase, BTC probably is my best option to do that. Of course, I can't do dozens of international purchases, and certainly not at the same time that thousands of people need to do dozens of international transactions, like that would break the network down. And that's the real problem there is like, yes, given the situation right now, if I were to need to spend $1 million in BTC, I wouldn't check the mempool because it would probably cost me $10 or something to settle that amount. But if, maybe at the peak of 2017 or even just a few months ago, the fees were up at $8-9 for just a standard transaction. And if, let's say 100,000 people wanted to do business in BTC at the same time, well, that's just not an option. And the problem is that we have 7 billion people on the planet, and there's not really a way for everybody to scale into doing that. And so when I tell somebody, hey, here's a good idea, you can do international business in this asset called BTC because it's got all this liquidity and blah, 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 that's only true with a lot of asterisks after it. And that kills the whole pitch, in my opinion.
Right, okay. And those asterisks, certainly you're privy to and you know a lot about. But I also wanted to talk to you about top-down support. Now, one of the things that isn't discussed perhaps enough is with gold, historically, as it's emerged as some sort of asset, depending on how you look at it, there's been a lot of global support. And we know that almost every nation on this planet supports that sort of perspective of value, because obviously at the end of the day, it is all perspective. But with BTC, that hasn't happened in the same way. In fact, there's been a lot of resistance because of the concerns, and Libra is another conversation that really just reinforces this fear. So I wanted to talk to you about that and whether or not we're overlooking the power of top-down support when it comes to something like this. Is it an imperative?
Not necessarily. I think you look at it as any cultural revolution, or you can look at a technological revolution too. It's the same thing with the internet. Like, you were a very weird person in 1995 if you had an email address. People would assume things about you. Oh, he's some kind of nerd. I wonder if he's got a postgraduate degree in computer science. Is this person a 35-year-old virgin? You get all these associations with a guy who has an email address in 1995. Whereas today, email is becoming obsolete at this point. I'll just shoot you a Telegram message or hit you up on social media. And
what's an email?
So yeah, precisely.
Right.
So, and so that's a very much kind of a groundswell thing where, the nerds would email each other until all of a sudden the nerds and their spouses would email each other. And now it's the point where I can email grandma and that's all. So that's a groundswell kind of thing. And that's okay. And I think technology can do that in a lot of ways, especially disruptive technology. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem. In fact, in some ways it's a good thing because, in let's say Turkey or Zimbabwe, for example, their top-down structures are specifically set up to harm the people in their own countries. So I don't even care to impress the hierarchies and places. So,
Kurt, I really respect your answer because I can see the agenda behind it. You want to empower the people. Is it fair to say that it's come possibly this technology at the best time in history? Given that we've seen the power of social media, for example, coupled with hardware that can really facilitate, the spread of information. Do you think it's also another fundamental asset that social media exists to really spread a narrative, whether that be BTC or some other point of value or currency or SOV? Do we underestimate the power of social media to really be one of the core assets of BTC itself?
I mean, it's a double-edged sword. In many ways, like I've been taking pictures of my newborn son, and I've been hashing them to the blockchain and then sending a link to people like, here, look at baby pictures. So rather than sending photos, I'm sending links that are hashed to the blockchain.
Right.
And then having people be like, well, what the heck is this? Oh, well, and then I'll explain how it works, and then that's a conversation starter. So, that's the good part. That's the easy distribution. But then you have like the social media manipulation part that I think is the opposite side of that sword, as people who are paid shills or bot armies, which is something that we know is effective from the last couple of political campaigns and things as well. So why wouldn't it be functioning in the cryptocurrency space? And then just the general toxicity. You got very weird tribalism, and Yeah. So
Such an interesting conversation. I mean, we could talk for hours. I mean, one of the things I did want to talk to you about is in that shift in the 2015 period of time when you mentioned that SOV became that strong narrative and push. Obviously, those who had bags of BTC were really advocating for that. But in saying that, is it possible that people started to switch on to their own power, especially if they had a position in the public eye, to really espouse their own position, their own investment portfolio?
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you see the same thing with, attractive young girls on Instagram. I mean, they're monetizing their bags too. Their bags just aren't cryptocurrencies. Their bags are
Exactly.
their figure and their ability to edit photos well.
Mm.
And, so why wouldn't it be the exact same thing, especially with how little people understand about the technology? It's almost like you get to be the high priest, and just say, well, I will translate to this, or I'll translate this to you for a fee, and
Yep.
there's a whole business model around translating things that seem to be complex to people who are interested in learning them. And
Right.
obviously they attract good people to us, but then you have the people who are, oh, okay, I'm just going to get rich selling seminars and speaking engagements and whatever else.
But in this era, one of the anomalies is we're seeing literally the flogging, as in Australia, as in selling, as in pitching and shilling. We see that happening a lot with digital assets, which is an anomalous term anyway. If we go to talk about crude value, even if we say that we see people shilling currencies, or we see prospective assets being shilled, that are now able to be purchased and coloured as investments. I mean, once again, this is a little bit different to perhaps selling handbags, online, so it's a challenging thing to stomach the idea that narratives, networks, and brands are superseding the technology. Are you seeing any of that?
Absolutely. And I think that's really the insidious part of it, is that if you have any ability to play around with a computer from a coding standpoint, you can copy and paste. I could bang out a blockchain in 5 hours. I could make Kurt coin, and if I explain to everybody why Kurt coin is going to take over the world, and hey, and I heard eBay is going to be accepting Kurt coin in 2020, and you can start to push out with just almost no investment and pretty good internet marketing, and you can create millions of dollars of value that doesn't actually exist. And then you rip it out of people's hands, you dump it. That pump and dumps are effective because people are ignorant and emotional. And there's a reason we have the SEC and all of these different things. Like pink sheet IPO stuff happened 20 years ago in the US, the stock exchange. A lot of people went to prison for doing exactly that. Boiler room tactics, calling, hey, this new company is going to create a pill that's going to make everybody lose weight, and you need to buy it at this price. And there was never a company. It never existed.
Right.
And, so doing the same thing with crypto is that much easier because people are so ignorant to what it is and how it works and what's actually happening. And all you have to do is build a decent website. Or in 2017 with the ICO craze, truly all you had to do was make some inferences, have a good website, have a good venture capital backed like branding campaign, and you could make millions of dollars inside of a couple of months with very little investment.
Right, and it just showed the power of belief, because once again, people were driven by the market movement. The bull literally brought in the attention, and from there, the narratives flowed. But I want to bring it back to BTC in this literal conversation and question about the value of belief, because right now, when we discuss, the agenda of for some to advocate for a currency, we see now that the SOV still remains strong as the fundamental narrative asset for Bitcoin. Now, in the context of pyramid schemes, I want to talk about that with regard to Bitcoin billionaires. What we've seen in proof, solely on proof, right from the beginning, we see those who were in early, regardless of their own position as cyberpunks or not, they profited immensely from their position, whether they call that investment, whether they call that, storing their currency that they want to use later if it ever happened with the technology. Regardless of how they look at it, they got very, very wealthy. And over time, that wealth disparity, comparison, quite arguably has increased in terms of if we jumped into BTC now, you wouldn't have the likely returns, the same as, early on. So are you concerned at all about wealth disparity, especially if you look at the Gini coefficient? There's lots of suggestions. There's some real concerns there.
I mean, kind of. At this point, I'm actually more bearish long-term on BTC anyways. So I would be more concerned about wealth disparity long-term and creating, this sort of impenetrable hierarchy of wealth if I believed that BTC had the fundamental value that those advocates say that it does. And I actually disagree. I don't think that BTC can become $1 million a coin doing what it does today. And it really can't do much more than it does today. So the real question is how many people need to buy Bitcoin for it to be worth $1 million a day or $1 million a coin? And then how can the technology support that? What would it even take for that many people to have a long position on BTC? It can't deal with traffic. So I'm a little bit like the worst part of me wants to see those sort of self-righteous billionaire types be totally wrecked and having to go get a day job again.
Right. Well, Kurt, I want to talk about that also in terms of the good side of crypto, because there are good people. There are certainly people trying to develop, and the proof is in those who want to advocate for a means in which someone from Africa can transact very seamlessly with someone from the US and not, have any barriers, and have more of an equal playing field. That's truly altruistic by philosophy. Now, when we talk about $1 million BTC, I want to ask you, mate, as someone from the Western regions, more affluent regions of the world, what's the true benefit, and who benefits from $1 million Bitcoin? If we're talking about something that accrues such immense value, how on earth is that correlated to the traditions of currency developments? To me, it doesn't quite make sense.
No, it doesn't, and it's not. It doesn't have a correlation to traditional assets, and it certainly doesn't help the African that could use it, like you just mentioned. And something I've said for a long time is, how many brilliant entrepreneurs don't have access to the world economy? And the answer is we don't know, and nobody's even attempting to give them access to it. And one of the things, it was about 3 years ago now. I remember Samson Mao, who's the spokesman for Blockstream. And he said that Bitcoin just isn't for people that make less than $2 a day. And to me, like I heard that statement, and that hurt me. And I just said, no, that's exactly who it's for. Like that, those are the people who just by pure circumstance of where they were born, don't have the ability to sell something in Japan or the United States or the EU, and they could be brilliant. We could be talking about people that are absolutely the best, brightest, entrepreneurial and inventive, creative minds in the world, and they are stuck, landlocked by bad technology and bad government systems that don't allow them to connect to the rest of the world. And the BTC community completely rejects any notion that they should be able to participate in the world economy with BTC. But they also, however, don't think any other asset has any value at all. Yes. So they're completely writing off the entire developing world. Right. In which case I say, okay, so then who's buying your coin to make it worth $1 million a coin, and who does that benefit? And the answer really is, Tyler and Cameron Winklevoss, or the various big exchanges, CZ from Binance, like all these guys who are lucky enough to exactly. And I don't care about them. They might be very nice people in their own right, but I don't really care about them. Not nearly as much as I care about the people who can be liberated.
And just listening to you say this, literally all the hairs in the back of my neck are standing up, because it really upset. I'm a teacher, and for me, the idea of precluding some from my classroom really just doesn't sit well with me. Just to hear literally what you're saying, it's unnerving, because at the end of the day, this was supposed to be about literally changing the status quo when it came to sound money. So I want to ask you this as well, Kurt. When we hear Andreas talk about sound money, but also in the same breath, we hear him also supporting certain new startups, being advisors in the back end for those, trying to advocate for certain new technologies, that's fine. But if you're going to suggest something sound money, the question is, sound for whom? If some are not part of that narrative and can't actually access it for the benefit of their own, upward social mobility and economic mobility, how is this truly and authentically sound money?
It's not. It's an insider asset for a small group of self-crowned intelligentsia and a new aristocracy. They see themselves as the new elite aristocracy of some point in the future, and they hope it's sooner than later. And I think that's the primary driving mechanism of those people. I don't think they really care about anything else except for accruing more value and more power and more praise for themselves. They clearly want to be...
Sure, but surely with Andreas, for example, I mean, he's an intelligent guy and he does understand economics. But the question comes forward once again, if we're talking about sound money, then generally over time, historically, there's a propensity for it to stabilize, to become much less volatile than the current situation in most of crypto. So I want to ask you this to better understand, given your understanding of fundamental economics, is that how can you possibly have this juxtaposition between an extremely volatile SOV asset based on belief and then have, the eventuation or the graduation towards something that could essentially become or needs to become more stable for it to be trusted and globally transacted, obviously for that African party to be able to trust the nature of the ecosystem so that they aren't going to lose out overnight and not only lose their bread for tomorrow, but literally their house.
Well, and I think that's exactly it. It just doesn't make sense. And that's really the whole conversation is those two things don't connect. I don't see a place where the whole BTC narrative and changing the whole world actually connect. It doesn't bridge, in my opinion. At least I don't see it.
Okay. Now, stable coins, they should be something that you would have been paying attention to, especially any that are adopted from enterprise as a corporate coin or those from the government. And we're starting to see that now in 2019. It's quite exciting in the sense that, one thing Andreas does raise that's fascinating is this interplay or this triad between the people and their movement, in this very, very active era when it comes to technology and money and empowerment. And also we see the corporations starting to move, utilizing the benefits of this new technology and now governments, and happening, in an interesting order because it's the people that started it. But what tends to happen in each of these technological revolutions is eventually the government gets a hold of this, and because of their position, they can really architect, with global dominance. Does it concern you that the stable coins are potentially leading into much more top-down control of the beauty of Bitcoin?
Absolutely. And that's the thing. Like they serve a utility. They're not innately bad. Like I don't believe that a stable coin can be evil unless we believe all of the rumors about Tether, which may or may not be true. My opinion is a little bit back and forth because there's so much unknown there. But but a stable coin is not sound money. It is just digital fiat money on a blockchain. And so that's not really, it's certainly not the revolution that got me excited for cryptocurrency or for Bitcoin initially. But it is probably a necessary stepping stone because it's a reprogramming period, and you have to have these things. We've seen them in cultural transitions for a long time. Like, I make a lot of religious inferences about Bitcoin because it actually makes the most sense. I actually think the Christian church is the longest and largest experiment in decentralized governance that the world has. So it's important to look at, like, okay, they went from a structured hierarchy to then having various hard forks of Protestantism and things that...
I've never heard anyone say this before. It's interesting.
But I think it's a really apt analogy that I think a lot of people ignore. Because you're seeing, like, what do we fundamentally believe about God in that situation? But it's the same thing about governance of a blockchain. Like, well, we do actually have the power to be what we want to be, and then therefore influence Bitcoin to be what we want it to be, and all of these different things. And we see these things happen slowly. Like the Christian church went from one very rigid, specific thing to being kind of an open discussion. There are a lot of Christian denominations that have lesbian pastors now, and in that community,
it's really interesting. It's so interesting you're mentioning this, because once again, what underpins all of these different sort of sects of religious fellowship is belief. So if we go back again to the narratives of crypto, what underpins that, essentially, first and foremost, it is belief. We know this because we see projects like Dogecoin, for example, that's really been forthright in saying it's essentially nothing. But regardless, it's narratives. It's, once again, could be, to use that analogy, it could be just another form of religion or a religious, sort of offshoot. So it's just interesting, the analogy you're making.
Yeah. Well, it's the thing. If it has value to you, then who's to say it's wrong? Like if me and you want to do business in Dogecoin all day, it's a tool that's there. We can prove back and forth. It has most of the fundamental utilities of Bitcoin that matter, and it's easier to transact in. So I mean, to say that Doge is bad is the same thing as saying that Mormonism is fundamentally bad. And
right, but let's pull it back a little bit, though. There's a few things there. One of them is in terms of global trust. Trust in, whether it be the trustless system or whether it be some other centralized system. The point of trust meaning stability, in the value. Because when we're talking about something that's economically driven, we're talking about people's livelihoods, we're talking about people's money. So in that sense, if we liken it again to that religious analogy, even today, there are those at the top. There are those that have really, there are churches at the top who really have, significant coffers, and that seems to be the case with anything. So it's much like businesses. If you look at Google as one other example, or Facebook. So the thing I did want to ask you, given Libra is moving in the direction, we're seeing governments now look at digital currencies to try and have some sort of top-down control. Whether or not we, argue that stable coins have the backing of currencies and thus, haven't really changed status quo, it's the stability, that I want to talk about. Because even today, in all the forks of Bitcoin that have emerged, and you're certainly an advocate of SV, there's still relatively strong arguments to suggest there's no proof of stability to come anytime soon.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's a cultural change. It's going to take a very long time to have it be commonplace to denominate things in Bitcoin, for example. I can't even imagine going to the car dealer and this vehicle will be 0.03 Bitcoin. that's the unit we go for. And that's a generational thing.
Yeah, so that divisibility argument's used a lot, but it is interesting you say that, because once again, that could be a challenge to the finite nature of this, given that, if we stay with that low block size and that limited supply in that sense, then arguably, as this reaches such an immense capacity, then the numbers will be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it'll be a weird thing. Well, and that causes all kinds of other issues too. That how do we denominate? Did Satoshi assume that we would tokenize some other asset that we use as the unit of account, and then Bitcoin is just sort of this underlying plumbing layer or whatever? And we don't know. And there's a lot of different directions things could go. BTC, for example, can't really tokenize like that, so that's not really a debate to have on BTC again, which is another reason I'm bearish on it. But yeah, it's that unit of account is a really complicated concept, because Bitcoin could become $1 million a coin, but not have any more purchasing power than it has today either. If the fiat valuation collapses, or let's say or worldwide fiat collapses, which is something that's totally plausible given a lot of what's going on today. Where a Volkswagen is a $20,000 car brand new. It might end up being, it's $100 million in this new devalued fiat currency, but the Bitcoin value of it is roughly the same. So these sort of fluctuating valuations there's a lot of unknowns there, and that's kind of what I like about it, is that we're sort of having a philosophical experiment in real life as to what money even is, because it's clearly a debatable thing. But I don't know how that's going to shake out. And stable coins, they really do work in the sense that people can understand that basic unit of account. But we need to be moving away from that, because the fiat is innately problematic, and that's why Bitcoin was invented in the first place.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense. I really understand now that you're trying to pull away from all previous entities when it comes to money. So let's talk about your camp for a moment, because I don't know as much as I probably should about the technology that underpins this, and more importantly, how you're going to scale to achieve the outcome that your camp want to do, but not at the cost of those currently that are getting wrecked at the same time by regarding things as investments?
Sure. But you mean BSV specifically?
I do, yeah. Specifically,
okay.
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah. So, for me, like I look at BSV as it really covers all of the promises that were made by Satoshi, which is why it's named what it is. It's Satoshi's vision. But it also is focused on some of the newer ideas of tokenization and smart contracts and all of these different things that have sort of emerged out of BTC refusing to scale and take on those. In fact, not only refusing, but actually stripping away those abilities. BSV is fundamentally moving back to the 0.1 software version of Bitcoin and only optimizing code in such a way that it's non-consensus. So, like, what is the protocol of a car? Like, what are the rules that make a car, an automobile? Well, it's 4 wheels and a steering wheel and seat belts. But a Honda, right? But even the engine is debatable now. You can do electric or you can do combustion, but both are still cars. So that's a protocol thing. But if I add wings, it is no longer a car. Now it becomes some other thing. Now maybe it's an airplane. Maybe it even deserves a completely new name. So that's a protocol change. But within the protocol of what is an automobile, you can have a Honda Accord or you can have a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. And there's a lot of variation in that protocol. And that's what Bitcoin is capable of too. So there's a very specific protocol that is Bitcoin. And those are the consensus items, that Bitcoin is 21 million coins, the block time is 10 minutes, it uses SHA-256 as its mining algorithm. And there's dozens of other things that are protocol Bitcoin. This is how Bitcoin works. But some of the things that are not protocol, block size, for example, it was not a protocol thing. It was actually added after the fact. It was added silently by Satoshi. He didn't want anybody to know he capped it. And the reason is that he capped it so that the network couldn't be spammed to death because the network was so fragile. And he realized that somebody could show up and spam the network to death and kick the whole network offline. Well, that's not the case anymore. You can't do that with Bitcoin anymore because it's so more robust.
Right.
And it's professionally mined is really what it is today. Is the professional mining secures it against that sort of thing.
Yep.
So that block size cap was put there as training wheels, in my opinion, is clearly what Satoshi was doing with it. But if you take that cap off, then we have to ask, okay, so what does it do and what can it do? Well, fundamentally, Bitcoin is itself a distributed supercomputer. It's a mining network. Those mining computers are specialized computers, but they are RAM, storage, processing power, and networking capabilities. That's it. And what is that? Well, that's a computer or a computer network. So it is an incentives-based internet, essentially. And so what can we do with that? Well, absolutely anything you can do with a computer. So, and we're starting to see some of that on BSV, is the ability to, interesting, I can upload video directly to the blockchain and I can build an app directly into the blockchain that monetizes the view of it. So people can watch and do paying with micro payments, pay by the second. And if you watch 3 minutes and you think it's terrible, just stop watching. And you paid, 3 or 4 pennies, but it's a computer. And that's what people are ignoring about Bitcoin, is that it was designed fundamentally to be a computer. Right. Satoshi is quoted as saying all kinds of things about, Bitcoin should be, we can set it up to do pay to send email. Like, let's eliminate email servers and just use Bitcoin.
Right.
Now
I want to stop you there. I just want to stop you there for a minute, because there's so many things that people, I can imagine around the world listening, would be firing up about. Now, you're talking about programmable money. You're talking about the likes of the agenda come forward from Ethereum. We've seen that narrative. Now, in the white paper, there's no mention of that in literature to suggest, the evolution of this to become a smart contract-based system, to really enfranchise enterprise, to enable applications. That was never written in there. Now, that's not to suggest from my part that you can't evolve a white paper. I'm not suggesting that. But that the point I'm making is that you also have the camp from Roger about Bitcoin Cash. He's an advocate for not moving into programmable money, into that supercomputer narrative, which is essentially something more. It's morphed into potential for business to flourish. So what's your position when someone comes back at you in a debate and say, well, hang on, you're just the same as the others. You're also suggesting to change the original precepts and plans that were BTC's white paper.
I think that's why it's important to understand, let's look at the U.S. Constitution. It's something that's debated hotly. If you're very conservative, you believe the Constitution should be a very specific thing. And if you're very liberal, you believe the Constitution is a very specific but very different thing. But I think it's crucial to then look at, okay, who wrote the Constitution and why? And what were their... So it's important to read like the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. Let's say James Madison wrote the Constitution primarily. So, okay, what did James Madison believe about the world? And then from that, we can maybe infer what he meant by these various things he wrote in the U.S. Constitution. And I think it's important to do the exact same thing with the white paper. Like, okay, read the white paper, get comfortable with it. What are the things that make sense or maybe don't make sense or maybe need some clarification? And then say, okay, did people ask Satoshi for clarification on these things in 2009 or 8, 9, and 10? Because he was very active on social media at the time. And you can see a lot of people saying, hey, Satoshi, this doesn't make a lick of sense to me. What the heck is this thing about? And he would wax on and explain. He was crystal clear that, oh yeah, we want to do, pay by the moment, video consumption, or we can have websites that are powered directly, pay to play websites. And then,
so the conversation at the time was more about the unknown. It was like looking at things and saying, well, look, whatever's possible in the future, we're open to possibility, rather than closing it off as a finite, open source structure that was replicated in that white paper. Are you saying that was just the beginning from your position?
Well, yeah, and it came out into the wild. I mean, you got to think about how it came about. Like, there were no experts, right? Like, there was no such thing as a Bitcoin expert, because there's so much to digest as to what it is actually capable of, and nobody knew. But Bitcoin came out with several hundred opcodes, which opcodes are programming language. So then you have to ask, well, how many opcodes do I use when I send a transaction? And the answer is typically 0. So if I were to send you a BTC transaction or a BSV or BCH or whatever, any of the basic Bitcoin-based things, I'm not using any opcodes, none. And so, okay, well, why did Satoshi program in hundreds of opcode options? And what are these things? What do they do? Like, why does this one loop? And why does this one have code that allows it to loop into this other opcode? Like, what the hell would I do with that? Because it's not arbitrary. It's clearly was put there for a reason. And that's one of the things that's really appealed to me about Craig Wright, is that he started talking to people in 2014 and 15, like explaining to Nick Szabo, for example, oh, Bitcoin's Turing complete, and here's why. And you can have an output language in op return that connects and loops back into the transaction output of the next block. Nick Szabo is sitting there listening and like, that it does what? And, he laughed. He's like, this guy Craig doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Bitcoin doesn't do any of that. Well, Craig proved that it does. And that was the first conversation where people are like, like, how the heck did this Australian computer scientist even know that Bitcoin could do that? Because all the other people that had been suggested as, maybe Satoshi, they didn't even know the codes existed. They didn't know any of it was even there. And when they checked, they're like, oh, shoot, he's right. I can actually do that thing. And nobody ever noticed.
Well, let's talk about Craig. I mean, as a fellow Aussie,
sure.
I've actually texted with Craig in the past, just as someone who I was noticing on Twitter. He knew a great deal about things, and I wanted to know more. So I certainly am not suggesting that I think he's the sole party in this Satoshi sort of entity, but to me it's irrelevant. To me, what really matters is he was obviously part of the very early beginnings of this movement. And I think that's really what people need to be focusing on, is what this guy has to say in the context of others. Now, when we talk about the fact that, there's possibilities, and that Craig was clearly, as you say, aware of the coding prospects of this, and they've arguably built in some of these features. Now, today, if we fast forward, he talks a lot about enterprise. He talks a lot about business, and he talks a lot about centralized ownership as an entity. About N-chain as well, what he works with there. So my concern is how is Craig different, to Libra? If we're being real about this in the sense of the possibilities of applications onboarding, if it moves beyond just simply seamless sound money, but something more,
right.
What does that mean really for the African? That, if we allude back to that person that's just trying to use money.
So looking at it, BSV is the single simplest tool to use in the cryptocurrency space. There's very simple apps. There's extremely lightweight apps. So for the kind of people that only have access to very slow internet, for example, they have the ability to connect to the BSV blockchain through an SPV wallet, which is something that Satoshi was very clear about too, is that's how he intended for the network to work. Low bandwidth, like that you shouldn't be running the whole blockchain. You should connect directly. But then using it to broadcast, that anybody has the right to broadcast to the network. And that's something that the BTC community disagrees with, that no, it's a privilege to broadcast to the Bitcoin network. Whereas BSV says, no. Send an unreasonably small transaction value. But if it's valuable to you and a miner is willing to mine it, then send it. Just do it. And so it encourages that. It's actually begging people to build on-chain experiences and giving them the tools to do it for essentially free. One of the things that is...
The question is, in doing so, in adding in those applications into this as well, Kurt, is it fair to say that the transition from sound money moves into sound valorization of data? Because there really are distinctions between Ethereum and the Bitcoin camps. I mean, literally, sure, in that plural sense, because Ethereum's trying to support an ecosystem of developers, as one example, trying to build out an advocation for valorizing the work they do on chain. So are you more aligned with, that philosophy that Vitalik, puts forward of trying to push for, a new way of valorizing essentially what people are building in code, rather than the push just for money?
I would simply say, why not both? There's absolutely no reason not to be both. And in fact, gold is a great example. Gold is money, but it's also fillings in my teeth, and me and you are communicating right now through gold circuits, plain and simple. So the gold that's in my computer is not money. It is serving a completely separate purpose. It is a commercial application of a specific tool that is both money and something else. And it's not really up to me or anybody else to say what is the only use case for a certain asset. Frankly, if somebody comes up with something way cooler to do with gold than what we're doing with it today, well, that'll make gold's value go up. But somebody's got to do it. Somebody can do it. And it's the same thing with Bitcoin. Bitcoin's the exact same thing.
Right. Well, let's talk about the comparison with mainstream markets and, I guess, the assets there. Things like Berkshire Hathaway, I think, is a good analogy, because I would imagine that the camps, like yourselves, want to do programmable money. You want to emerge with an asset that underpins it, that just grows in the same sense. So once again, if the philosophy is such that it can be money, and it can also be this digital asset that enables the flourishing of applications, doesn't that also suggest that there's going to be a significant influx in the value of this asset as more applications come on board? And in that sense, does it compromise the integrity of the monetary position of SV?
The BCH advocates certainly seem to think so, and I have not heard an argument as to why that makes any sense to me. It's infinite. Well, like what is everything fundamentally? You have to break down, like, what is a Bitcoin transaction, or what is the Bitcoin blockchain? What is a blockchain? What's data? It's the ledger. The ledger is actually the value. It's your ability to write to it that is the transaction, or the coin that we're talking about. But the coin itself doesn't have value. It's the ability to write to the ledger. The ledger is the value. The data that then therefore is the value.
Mm.
So the value of a BTC unit is a certain thing, and a value of a BSV unit is a certain different thing. But that is the value. And those units allow you to write to an exclusive or an inclusive ledger. And so we're not really arguing, and there's not really a difference there between Litecoin or Dash or anything else. They're all ledgers. The ledger is the commodity.
Right, but but in the context of smart contracts, though, Kurt, and given that there are transactional fees, and given the simple math, fundamentally of how this system would work, surely as the system evolves, as the ecosystem becomes more robust with developers onboarding, then doesn't that suggest that the asset that underpins this really should correlate? And what I mean by that is, if we're trying to, support the idea of a global currency system, once again, using the arguments we put forward about BTC, doesn't that also suggest that with SV, there's an agenda to also uplift the value of that underlying asset? And is that asset actually money alone at that stage, or does it become something more, much like the Berkshire Hathaway sort of, analogy? I'm being quite serious about this, because if this ecosystem grows, should the price of, the asset underlying grow with it?
It's a really good question, and frankly, I think in many ways we're completely blazing new trails, and we don't know, because there are things that we can compare it to, but nothing we can compare it to in completion, because Bitcoin is so new and unique conceptually. We can make the gold analogy, or we can make like the internet analogy, or whatever else. But neither are perfect, right? Like they're both only half of the conversation. So we're talking about monetizing connectivity ultimately, right? And to do that, you're treating all connections as valuable. You're putting a price on making an internet connection, essentially. And so it's a fundamentally different asset. And what that means is I had a similar conversation with one of my colleagues at Crypto Traders. And he was saying, well, shoot, like, what if BSV never goes above $500 a coin? And well, that first of all doesn't change its utility as an asset to do all kinds of really great things with. I can use it as money, or I can use it as fuel for some metanet internet concept. It doesn't make it the greatest investment in the universe, obviously, if that's the sole reason you're here is to accrue investment value.
Which shows that most of the participants in crypto, that's the irony.
It is, and that's why this conversation is difficult. But at the same time, if we are to believe that it can function as sound money, the economic principles that we understand about sound money imply that the value should slowly go up as it begins to dominate other things and replace other assets. So I don't expect BSV to end up being the volatile long-term, like Bitcoin is traded today.
Right.
I expect it to, over time, slowly accrue that value as it accrues utility. But that's the challenge, is it needs to actually accrue that utility. It does need to earn it.
Right. Now, what about in terms of tech developments? Now, if we talk solely on the side of smart contract development, if we look at even the developments in terms of scaling layer one solutions, there's absolutely no question that improvements and tweaks have been made to the original Ethereum code, if we compare. So in that sense, you're even farther behind in that sense with regard to the crudeness of the code. It was the first iteration of all of them. So if you're trying to compete in this sort of smart contract domain, and also have the branding of BTC indirectly by being SV, are you concerned at all that there are solutions out there that are way ahead when it comes to the potential of being programmable internets of value and really valorizing data to spread across through a tokenized system?
I'm actually not worried about it at all. Ethereum is based on a false premise, right? That Bitcoin was fundamentally designed not to do smart contracts. And what we've seen is that turning back on Bitcoin's fundamental code that it came out with in 2008 has allowed it to do smart contracts exponentially more efficiently than Ethereum. So then it begs the question, why does it exist at all, frankly?
Well, can you teach us more about what you mean? How is it that it's more efficient, very specifically?
So right now, the block size limit is 2 gigabytes of data every 10 minutes, which is good for in the ballpark of 9,000 to 14,000 transactions per second. The size of those transactions is irrelevant. They can be a hundredth of a penny, or it could be $1 billion transaction. It doesn't make a difference. But it should theoretically be able to do 14,000 transactions a second, given the current limits of BSV, which should be lifted again in 2020 as well, to having no block size limit, and therefore having no limit to the amount of transactions that can be broadcast.
Okay.
But Ethereum, the way that Ethereum works is that it is a Turing complete distributed computer. But the problem, the inefficiency of Ethereum is that it needs to push all states to all nodes before it can settle. And
hence
that's
we have CryptoKitties, and we have the bottlenecks.
Exactly. Ethereum is good for about 15 to 20 transactions a second before it starts to really bottleneck and show that it's limited. Well, 15 transactions a second is certainly not good for a worldwide supercomputer. It is completely and utterly inefficient, or insufficient to do what its stated goal is. And therefore, Ethereum is, in my opinion, long-term, an overvalued asset. It doesn't work.
So the big question is, though, Kurt, could SV be in the same camp potentially if we do a comparative analysis to other? And I'm being really serious, because right now we see the emergence of layer one solutions that are far exceeding the capacity of Ethereum, quite literally, without trying to FOMO anyone into others. But they are far beyond the 15-second transaction speeds, the TPS. So does it worry you in that sense if they're also going after the same programmable approach, the same, tact in terms of trying to suggest that applications do matter, and that you can actually have an ecosystem that's, that is tokenized, has a unit of account, but literally is doing things far better, more efficient, and scaling, well beyond even SV.
Right. Sure. Yeah, and I should say, BSV could absolutely fail. I don't know, but I am theorizing. And some of the things that matter to me in a theoretical standpoint is, what are we giving up in order to have more transactions per second? And people argue that centralization is an issue on BSV, and I would say that that's debatable. I don't think it's wrong. In some ways, it is too centralized, but the roadmap of it should make it more and more decentralized over time, and we've seen it go there. So it started with really just CoinGeek and SV Pool and a couple other players, but now even Craig Wright's enemies via BTC, BTC.com. We've seen a couple other players that hate Craig Wright, who are mining BSV because it's profitable. So it is becoming more decentralized. Now, how do we get more transactions than BSV? You mentioned there are other good smart contract platforms, and there absolutely are. EOS is a great example. Stellar. There are a lot of places where these things are occurring. But the problem with them is that they're proof of stake networks, and proof of stake networks don't have that incentive to become more decentralized over time. So EOS has 21 block producers, which are essentially miners that don't mine. They're validating nodes. They compete to be those 21, but it'll never, ever, ever be more than 21 validators. So it's an innately centralized system that can never change the amount of validators that exist there. And it's actually been a controversy the last few weeks, is that it went from being globally distributed to almost all distribution being with large major players and geographically located almost entirely in China. So much so that I think it was 2/3 of all block producers can tie their venture capital money back to a single entity in China.
Right, and it doesn't surprise me, given that a lot of the things playing out even in the markets today. But again, staking is the predominant sort of means of consensus, the approach, and obviously that also they say it's secure as a network, but what it also does, it directly affects supply, directly affects the economics for those parties behind the scenes. So I understand what you're saying, but there are also efforts to move beyond even that. As you know, there's BFT approaches. There's also efforts to make POW models more leaderless, as you've seen with some of them. So the point I'm making is that POW is not the only narrative we're going to see in the future. that potentially does what you're suggesting. But certainly there's also criticisms about the exhaustive aspects of POW. When we're talking about power, a lot of people, don't like raising this discussion of just the fact that it is so consumptive, it is so wasteful when it comes to energy. But the reality is it is. And so is that at all a concern as well, given that, we're moving into an era that is also environmentally conscious, and the fact that this is still the first innings right now for technological innovation?
Right. There's a few ways to look at proof of work. One of them is philosophical. Like, I believe that value fundamentally needs to come from the creation of value. And if the creation of value is too easy, then you're creating arbitrary value, right? So I take a philosophical view that proof of work is a necessary step in the creation and securing of an asset that has value. So that part is much more of like a religious or a philosophical conversation.
Sure.
But if you look at the fundamentals of proof of work, like the usage of power worldwide and how we treat things, and then what we're actually trying to replace. Right now, what we're trying to replace is coinage and paper and plastic money. That's what exists in the world. Well, the manufacture of coinage primarily functions on zinc, which, if you know anything about zinc mining, is one of the worst things for the environment that we do. The strip mining and then the chemicals that go into refining zinc are awful. Plastic money is another one. The refining of plastic to make the billions of circulating notes that exist on plastic substrate is another thing. It's a huge environmental concern that we're trying to, again, replace with.
Right. And Kurt, I can hear this answer is really well rehearsed, because obviously you're right. There's no question that the current scenarios when it comes to money are extremely exhaustive when it comes, and wasteful, no question. But and those who want to go and look into those, they can certainly go and understand more of what you're saying. But if we just go back though to proof of work models though, the thing I want to ask is more a case of, just because others, are wasteful and provably so, is it a reason enough to have a proof of work model that also is provably so when it comes to, high energy consumption? And the question is this model sustainable the more it grows? That's my main concern. Is it algorithmically, does the scalability of this align with the potential to support it, given it is so demanding? When it comes to,
I think it does, and I always say, like, you can't preach your way out of a problem, and so you have to have an incentive. Everybody needs an incentive. I can't just work for free. As much as like I would love to be this perfect altruist, I can't be. I have to feed my family and pay my bills, and therefore any progress that I make has to have some incentive tied to it. And proof of work incentivizes the people that are consuming the power to come up with more efficient ways to create power. And we've seen a lot of that, actually. We've seen quite a bit of investment, especially in China and in Northern Europe. Like, people aren't aware, actually, that Kazakhstan does quite a bit of mining. And they've done a lot of research into renewable sources of the creation of energy. And that includes wind and solar and various things. You've seen a lot of investment into solar research, because it's such an asset, especially as you go further and further north into Northern Europe,
especially if it powers money in the future. Exactly. It's going to incentivize people.
Exactly. So it's creating this incentive to be like, well, shoot, all I actually need to do is create free power, right? And then that's a noble cause. And it's a noble cause with an incentive that can actually drive the research. And that's something that you can pitch to a venture capital firm or anybody else. You can even pitch it to even big oil, or let's say, like, hey, Mobil, I'm consuming X amount of, exawatts of power, and I need to do something more efficiently. And are you willing to invest in us doing $1 billion of research into coming up with the next stage of human energy creation?
Sure. I mean, that's the trade-off right now, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, the security and also the decentralization is very strong in all of the Bitcoin camps, and obviously for BSV as well. But the trade-off is, this being stifled by the high energy costs right now. And obviously there's improvements, but it is a real issue. Now, one of the things I really want to open up in this discussion, it just happened this week, is the Craig Wright drama, yet another one, when it comes to the legal battle. Now, this could have significant ripple effects, no pun intended, obviously with XRP, but it could have significant impacts when it comes to trust. for the entire ecosystem of cryptocurrencies, because
Sure.
at the end of the day, the core is still BTC when it comes to liquidity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if this is true, that he has lost this case and he has to transfer 500,000 BTC across to the Kleiman, is it Kleiman's? I think the
Kleiman. Ira Kleiman.
To Ira Kleiman, then let's open this discussion up, because surely that is a serious wound to the entire ecosystem if that happens, because it opens up immense vulnerabilities.
Yeah, no, it's a huge. I mean, it could be a reckoning, you know, and we've seen a lot of people across social media say, well, it can't happen because he's not Satoshi and therefore he doesn't have the coins, and I'm just not going to have that conversation. And first of all, is really unwise to not have a backup plan. But if you look at the liquidity across markets, and they talk about the ability to absorb that kind of sell pressure, and in some ways it looks like the markets could absorb that sell pressure if it's done in certain ways. But I've argued, first of all, Ira Kleiman is not a crypto guy at all. He has zero interest in any of that.
And he has to pay tax as well.
Exactly. He's going to need to pay something like $2 to $3 billion in various levels of taxation on that money. And if you look at the numbers now, Tether is actually traded more. There's more liquidity in Tether than there is in BTC on a typical day. Just over the last 6 to 9 months, it's kind of transitioned to Tether being the most traded asset in the crypto space.
Mm-hmm.
So then that begs the question. We are currently aware that Tether is 74% backed by fiat and other asset reserves. So we don't actually know how much fiat reserves there are to ever settle that circulation. So
that's yet another irony, though. If the most traded asset is a fiat-backed, item or digital asset, then it begs the question what this system is all about anyway. But sorry, continue on, because it's fascinating to hear what could eventuate if indeed Craig is part of this Satoshi, conglomerate, that started it off, or this Satoshi power. And if he indeed does transfer to Ira, who certainly has the choice to do whatever he wants.
Yeah. Well, the question is most people that are trading cryptocurrency are not settling their cryptocurrency in large amounts of fiat. People are mostly keeping stablecoin bags, or they're keeping Bitcoin bags. Those are the primary holdings of everybody in the crypto space. But the amount of people that are settling to fiat is very, very small right now. And we don't know how much fiat can actually be absorbed by any of this market at all, because the two major assets are primarily traded against an unknown amount of fiat reserves. And therefore, trying to settle out $3 billion into actual fiat wealth.
That's huge.
It's huge.
Right. It's more than huge, actually.
It could be absolutely catastrophic.
It's an absolute tsunami. Yes. And Kurt, I want to be frank about this in this context, because you would know. The real volumes that are happening in this ecosystem are not what people see. So given not only the Tether scenario, given that there's a propensity now for the players in crypto to not move into the fiat world completely, IRA could. Volumes are not necessarily all authentic and real. So does that compound the risks even further if IRA makes that move?
Yes. There's a couple of people that aggregate estimates on true volume, and true daily volume that is not faked is supposed to be something like $2 billion a day. But those dollars are tethers. Of those tethers, the best case scenario that I've heard is that they're 74% backed. So we're already under $2 billion a day for sure in actual worldwide liquidity.
So does that worry you?
No, immensely. It's a huge problem. And it's something I've actually been crowing about for a very long time, that the fundamental value of Bitcoin needs to be its ability to buy other things. And if people aren't buying other things with it, the only thing they're actually buying with it are tethers.
Yes, so, it's really interesting you say that, because you don't get a lot of people, in the public domain or in the public who are public leaders of crypto, especially in the Bitcoin camps, are really advocating in a very forward way about spending BTC. I remember seeing recently a very a very brave YouTuber. His name is Christoph, and I'm not advocating either way. I just noticed that I'd watched this. He was saying, we need to get out and we need to be spending, whether you're in any camp at all, regardless. He was, making the point that that's the whole point of a currency itself. So it's interesting that very few are getting out there and being bold and brazen enough to say, well, at the end of the day, what are you really here for? Are you here to hodl? Are you here to just, be a chipmunk and, amass all the acorns? Or actually, are you here to change a narrative that has existed for millennia? So going back to Craig, it's clear you're concerned. It's clear that this is possible. I'm not suggesting that it's factual. I don't know. But one of the things that I did read into is the risk of perjury, the risk of falsifying documents. That's another very serious thing that I want to talk to you about, because what if Craig isn't part of the Satoshi group? What if he is, falsifying information, and that this is all just one big, stunt? I mean, how can we trust? Do you know what I mean? Like, I know that the court case is happening, but how do we know that he can even transfer that? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, we don't, and we don't until it happens. And it's funny because I'm in the camp, and I'm a huge advocate for BSV because I believe in the fundamental technology there, and therefore believe in the fundamental technology of Bitcoin. So I'm very much an advocate of that worldview. I have, however, been critical of Craig in many ways. I like him in a very basic sense as a person, but I think he is poorly rehearsed, and I don't like his attitude. I don't like the, calling someone a prick or a dickhead or an idiot and then writing them off. It's just, it's not how I communicate. And I understand why he does it to a degree, but
well, I don't.
If that is,
I have to tell you, I don't, because I'm an Aussie and I know a lot of Aussies, and so does Craig. And I've written this in Twitter before. When you talk about tech, the challenging thing is separating your own agenda or more of the emotional. So I try to always forget about what I feel about Craig when I want to look at BSV or want to look at BTC, and that's what we're doing today. But if we're just talking about Craig, he does not encapsulate what I believe is the iconic Australian. He just doesn't. He's extremely arrogant. He is extremely privileged now, obviously, and he does exude the kind of confidence that someone who's become a billionaire overnight would do if they are already, very eccentric and very egotistical. So it makes me wonder, actually, if indeed Craig is involved, at some level of that early profiteering, whether it be being part of Satoshi or just being a cyberpunk. He's clearly got money. He's clearly benefited well. So the question now is, what will happen? And is he arrogant enough to even thwart the ecosystem himself? Because he technically could, if he has this kind of power, irrespective of IRA.
Sure. And that's one of the things that stood out to me. As I got more and more into reading about Bitcoin and reading Satoshi, I actually found Satoshi to be more and more dismissive. I think the more that you read Satoshi's words to, let's say, Dan Larimer or whoever, he just was very much like, he's famous for the line, if you don't get it, I don't have time to explain it to you, sorry.
Well, that sounds like Craig.
And it does sound like Craig. And, so these are some of the things, like, these are sort of the dots you can connect about the sort of dismissive intellectual, or Craig said 2 or 3 months ago that he has Asperger's syndrome. He's on the autism spectrum. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I could see that. He does get uncomfortable under social situations, so I could see that being plausible.
Yes, I can.
But I agree with you that I don't like his. I think we could be in a completely different place if he was more personable.
But isn't it the case also of Roger Ver? In the sense that I've noticed over the time I've been here, Kurt, that people who stand up for their own agenda, if it compromises the bag holdings of the majority, and let's face it, that's what happens when you challenge BTC in any sense. Everyone will attack you because it's their money. Sure. So I'm not suggesting that they're wrong or right, but it does happen time and time again, regardless of whether it was Craig, whether it was Roger, or anybody else, me, you, doesn't matter. The point is that people protect their interests, people protect their eggs when it comes to their basket of their portfolio. So when it comes to Craig, there's reasons to suggest that his own approach has been very unpalatable and very difficult to stomach, quite frankly. But also there's been a very strong and vitriolic reaction to him because he's also trying to challenge BTC.
Right. But that's a tactic too. And here's why I was going to say that I can kind of understand why he does it. And I don't know how this is in Australia because I haven't visited and I don't know the nuances of Australian culture. But in the US, we have been at war since 2011 or 2001 rather. So this is most of my life. This is every young adult has veterans in their lives. There's a huge post-traumatic stress disorder problem in the United States. And one of the things that stands out, I talk to a lot of veterans, and it's the fact that they were trained to dehumanize the enemy. Don't look at them as a person. Look at them as something other. And then in battle, that's reinforced. Like, this is why you get the racist epithets and things like that you just kind of, I'm going to go kill this person. So I don't want to, well, where did he meet his wife? I don't want to know that information. I want to categorize him as a dangerous other and be done. And I look at cryptocurrency a little bit the same way. Like, we are amid a culture war in the cryptocurrency space. And Craig has been a prominent member of the least popular narrative in the crypto space for a very long time.
Yes.
And I can see him more and more moving toward that sort of dehumanizing aspect of some of these players. And I can start to relate with it with some of the people like the Samson Mao is a good example of just an utterly toxic person. He's vitriolic. He writes everyone off. He will call you an idiot the exact same way Craig will call you an idiot, except it's accepted because Samson is a respected member of the
Right. Well, I would challenge that. I wouldn't say that I would respect anyone who does that. I don't care if they are part of a camp that has the most money. I just don't respect that behavior at all. But the reality is that the reason it's respected is not because of his behavior. It's because of the portfolio. It's because of the agenda underlying it. And that's, we really don't talk about that enough. Because if we see a flippening of value in BTC overnight and everything changes to some other direction somewhere else, you're going to see a lot of support in that other direction too, because of the flow of money, potentially. So we go back again, though. We know that Craig, has his own personal agenda. We know that he has, his own issues when it comes to his demeanor, his presentation, his arguments. But the thing I do want to raise is, do we underestimate the power of the youth? That those who are the predominant users, consumers, participants, investors in this environment, because they aren't Craig's age per capita, if you do the analysis, the demographics certainly not in his favor. And is it the case that people are looking for almost the opposite narrative, where they want to know that they're contributing to the wider society? That's sold by the BTC camp, as a narrative. They want to know that they are part of the majority, and that they're advocates for change. All of that's still being done really well. And we also have speakers in the BTC camp constantly pushing out content to that effect. So you're up against all of that. Sure.
And it's an uphill battle. I fully admit that we're definitely coming from behind. The only analogy that I like to say is, we're actually, think of it as we're on a race to Mars and we've yet to leave the atmosphere. And I'll argue that we've left the atmosphere when the common person starts to denominate or starts to use a cryptocurrency transaction once a day. Let's just say the average person makes one cryptocurrency transaction per day. At that point, I will argue we've left the atmosphere, and we're starting to get to the point where whoever is doing that the most is an insurmountable thing. We're not going to pass that player up, at least not in a very long time. But we're not there yet. So I think we're both on the launch pad. I think BTC maybe has slightly left the launch pad, but it's certainly not proven that it is going to successfully exit the atmosphere.
So no moons anytime soon.
No, I don't think we're there at all. I think, still very much, the developers will tell you it's still beta software. Bitcoin software is not even version 1.0. It's 0.18 and some change is the is the current BTC software version. So they look at it as a project that can fail. Looked at somebody like Luke Jr. as a very influential Bitcoin Core developer, and he says, no, I'd give it barely 50-50 that Bitcoin succeeds.
It's amazing you would say that in that scenario, and at least he's being honest about that. The thing I wanted to ask you, because obviously we could talk forever and we really can't, but what's the biggest threat, Kurt, for you, or what's the biggest challenges in the from now and let's say in the next 6 months to a year, because everything moves so fast. Because we were already talking about what Andreas had mentioned, the threats from the top down. Enterprise and government are real, significant means in which the whole benevolent prospects of peer-to-peer borderless money and transfers of value can emerge. We're seeing proof of that right now. So what's the big concern for you? It doesn't sound like BTC worries you at all, but other things do.
Culture. It's people. There's a million things that could happen, but I believe that the right attitude can make the best thing happen even under the worst circumstances. So the most important thing is culture. And to me, the culture of BSV, the thing that I really like is it's very much opposed to a focus on the fiat value of the coin because it doesn't change the utility. BSV is just as useful if it's a penny a coin as it would be at $1 million per coin. The utility does not change at all. It is just as useful as money. It's just as useful as a smart contract platform and MetaNet and all the rest of it. And BTC is not. BTC is quite a bit less valuable because its only tool, the only thing that it does is hold fiat value right now. So culturally, we can survive a bear market far better than our opponent. The guy across the field will be destroyed by a bear market that lasts too long.
Well, it's interesting you say that because literally in the last 3 days or 2 days, we've seen immense market movement for BTC because everything's so reactionary.
Yep, for sure. And so then you see the virtue signaling on Twitter. I'll hold till whenever. I'm a holder of last resort or whatever. And that's obviously not the case because people, they do sell their Bitcoin. They do exit markets. And especially a lot of the people that got in over the last 2 or 3 years have been mostly underwater for the last 2.
That's true.
Really,
do you think there's a bit of insincerity with regard to those public statements and that kind of leverage signaling, because many of them aren't really disclosing the fact that they are selling into fiat or that they are selling out, buying a lot of the other startups or altcoins, as you say. There's a lot of very malignant behavior behind the scenes that many of the Bitcoin maximalists, perhaps, or any maximalist in itself, may not be disclosing when they do pro altcoin sort of activity. When they go and support or they invest in something that's not necessarily just Bitcoin, what does that actually mean for their own maximalist agenda? Are they indeed a maximalist at that point?
No, I don't know that anybody really actually is, because if you talk to the people who claim to be Bitcoin maximalists, they'll have big conversations about, Grin was the coin that was out 6 months ago, was Andy Polstra from Blockstream wrote this Mimblewimble white paper and it's great. And you have these people that are absolutists when it comes to BTC, but then, Lightning Network's going to connect to Litecoin and stuff too, and all these different things. And, there was a leak just a couple days ago that a number of big BTC maximalists were being paid as advisors to a couple of Ethereum-based.
Yes, that was huge. Well. That was a huge thing because it just showcased that there was almost this hypocrisy happening where they'll shill the BTC bags because they obviously have a huge stack of them. Some have even mentioned that their portfolio is up to 50% just in BTC. Yeah. But yet, if they're going to advise for something that uses an ERC20, what the bloody hell's going on?
Total conflict of interest, 100%. I wouldn't trust them from either end, actually. The Ethereum people, I would assume that they would be giving me bad advice on that end too. So
it's challenging.
It's patently dishonest. The incentives are completely misaligned. And in a more rational world, these people would be sent out on a rail. They would just be laughed at and say, hey, you are plainly dishonest and I'm not interested in your opinion, and then that's the whole conversation.
Well, Kurt, you're a brave man to have, to speak from a camp. Firstly, that puts you in the firing line. You have your very strong views, and I respect anyone who's going to stand up and say what they think. So thank you very much, mate, for this first chapter of hopefully what comes to be the book that is the Kurt Conversations, because at the end of the day, my channel is open to anyone who's going to put forward an argument, try and educate us about your position. You've done more than that today, mate. Is there anything you'd like to do to just conclude the conversation today so people can really get an understanding of what your agenda is?
I think stop the grandiosity. Cryptocurrency doesn't need more cheerleaders. In fact, it's almost all cheerleaders. We need more people that are willing to do work. Don't be afraid to build a business and be the person that creates the value of the coin that you're holding. And that can be whatever, if you want to build on a blockchain of your own, it's not about the value that the blockchain can give to you. It's about the value that you can create using the blockchain as a tool. So build a business that creates transactions and creates volume there. Be an entrepreneur. We are so thin on entrepreneurs in this space that are willing to build a business. Everybody's an investor or they're some kind of advisor or whatever. And that is not sustainable. And if we don't change that part of the culture, we're all going to suffer for it. So please think of ways that you can create external value using Bitcoin or any other blockchain as a tool.
Got it.
And
well, it's good to hear that you're also open-minded. What I'd like to hear, just as a recap, is that whilst you are very much pro BSV, very much about the Satoshian vision, what is very clear is you're not anti the whole environment. You're not anti-development. You're not anti other layer one solutions, but you're first and foremost all about trying to advocate for real enterprise, real entrepreneurial endeavor, and most importantly, real applications. Things that can do real shit, not these narratives of everything is a shit coin or everything is polarized. What I like about hearing from you is that you actually want to see this technology transform our outcomes, give us better social and economic mobility, and hopefully that comes to the fore and is enfranchised by some of these technologies. Again, you're in the controversial camp with Craig Wright. Right now in hot water. Clearly, there's a lot of discussions in the future. But one thing I just want to add as well that you mentioned that needs to be broached again is that it's one thing to support or to criticize a person. It's another to, explore the benefits of tech. You made that very clear today that your agenda is technologically based. And I really do thank you for making that distinction, Kurt.
Sure. No, and it's crucial. Craig is only as valuable as the most value he can create. And if he ceases to create value, that should be irrelevant. It should be irrelevant to BSV as much as it's irrelevant to everything else. I believe that truly great things are the product of great competitors. So when I say develop on something else, make something cool on Dash or Stellar or Ethereum or EOS, come up with a killer application, because I want the best competitors to compete with each other, because that's how we benefit. We get the spillover benefits of great people competing, and it's crucial. And we shouldn't be so tribal, and it shouldn't be about the people. I can be friends with anybody who can respect me as a human being, and the blockchain that you like the best should not be a deciding factor in how you treat other human beings.
Exactly.
So
and it shouldn't even be about likability. It should be all about the technology itself. What is really the utility? And that's the thing you really drove home today, is that that's your focus. And all of these tribal camps need to just basically bugger off so that we can get to the business of building. So thank you very much, Kurt, for being so candid, so forthright, so transparent. That is extremely rare, mate. Hopefully we can catch up again. But if you'd like to know more, make sure you do check out Kurt's channels and all of his social media. I'll make sure they're in the descriptions below. So CryptoTradersPr.com is one of his key links. And Kurt, once again, you're well known in the space. You're very well connected. Thank you very much, mate, for making time to speak with me today.
Thanks for having me on, Brad. It's really been a lot of fun for me too.
Likewise, mate. Take care.